There was something different in the air that day, not dramatic, not disruptive, but deeply felt. A subtle shift, like a change in pressure before a storm, though no clouds could be seen. No crowds cried out in protest. No alarms sounded in the squares. And yet, within the timeless stone walls of the Vatican, something had changed. It wasn't noise that signaled it, but stillness. A peculiar, almost tangible silence. The kind that falls only after something unexpected has happened, something unspoken, yet undeniable. When the white smoke curled upward above the Sistine Chapel, and the bells of St. Peter's began to toll their ancient song, the world responded with joy. Cheers erupted from the faithful gathered in the square. Journalists raised cameras. Banners waved. The voice from the balcony echoed across the rooftops. Habemus Papam. We have a pope. Pope Leo XIV. But within the inner halls of the Apostolic Palace, the atmosphere was different. Deep within the Vatican's quiet corridors, where frescoed ceilings looked down on centuries of decisions, something else was stirring. In the offices of the Curia, in the antechambers where prelates meet behind closed doors, there was no celebration, only pause. Conversations grew cautious. Footsteps slowed. And although nothing was said aloud in those first few hours, the feeling was unmistakable. Uncertainty, held in check only by formality. Like wind rustling through leaves, whispers began to move among those in the know, brief exchanges, sidelong glances, the kind of quiet that often means more than words. It was not long before these murmurs found a focal point. The room of tears. That private, sacred space where every newly elected pope is led immediately after the final ballot. There, behind locked doors, the man called to lead the church dons the white cassock for the first time. There, in silence, he gathers himself before stepping out into the light of history. But this time, something felt off. The attendants who stood just beyond the threshold, discreet and trained to see without watching, sensed it. The moment lasted longer than usual. The air was colder than it should have been. Something had passed between those walls that no one could quite explain. There were no raised voices, no visible disruption. But there had been a pause just long enough to be noticed. A glance exchanged between officials. A hand that lingered near a doorframe. The kind of subtle shift that those familiar with ecclesial ceremony could not ignore. Soon, speculation began to fill in the blanks. Had something been said? Had someone entered who was not expected? No one could confirm it publicly. And yet, quietly, a story began to take shape. Some whispered that a senior cardinal had spoken with the newly elected pope before he made his first appearance, briefly, but with intensity. Not with congratulations, nor with formality, but with something heavier. Not an insult, not a threat, but a message. Whatever was said, it left an impression. Not because of what it revealed, but because of what it implied. It suggested that this new papacy would not follow a script. That expectations would be unmet. That the days ahead might challenge more than they comfort. As the sun set on that historic day, the machinery of the Vatican resumed its usual rhythm. Statements were drafted. Appointments were confirmed. The external image remained composed. To the world, it looked like a smooth beginning. But beneath that polished surface, a quiet tension persisted. Not crisis, but anticipation. The kind that settles when people aren't quite sure what comes next. Pope Leo XIV was not the image many had imagined when they thought of a new pope. He was not charismatic in the way some had hoped. He did not arrive with sweeping gestures or captivating speeches. Instead, he moved carefully, deliberately. His first words were simple. His presence calm. But for some, that calm was unsettling. Because it did not invite applause, it invited reflection. And reflection, for many, is harder than reaction. And so, within the heart of the Vatican, a stillness deepened. Not from inaction, but from attention. A sense that something was being realigned. Not broken, realigned. And those who had long navigated the currents of ecclesial life could feel it. The Church was shifting, not in doctrine or in truth, but in tone. In focus. In spirit. And though no one could yet define what kind of Pope Leo XIV would become, they all understood one thing. He would not be predictable. He was not a firebrand, nor a reformer draped in slogans. He came without fanfare, without controversy tied to his name, without the weight of an agenda that demanded immediate allegiance or resistance. And yet, from the moment he stepped into view, the atmosphere shifted. Not through statements or decisions, but through subtle choices. In declining the grand accommodations of the Apostolic Palace, choosing instead the modest residence of Casa Santa Marta, Pope Leo XIV sent a quiet but unmistakable message. He would not be consumed by the machinery of tradition. He would not be absorbed into the long corridors of power that had, over time, become their own form of inertia. His papacy, it seemed, would be defined not by conquest or confrontation, but by presence. To some, this decision appeared pastoral, even refreshingly humble. But to others, it stirred concern. Not because of what it disrupted outwardly, but because of what it hinted at within. Among them was Cardinal Raymond Burke, a figure long known as a steadfast guardian of tradition, a man who had stood firm through turbulent waters in past pontificates. He had spent years defending the liturgy, the doctrine, the structure that bound the Church together through centuries of change. And now, as Leo's papacy began, Burke saw signs. Not dramatic ones, but nuanced. Hints, symbols, gestures that, when read through the lens of ecclesial experience, seemed to point toward an unraveling not through rebellion, but through softness. Not through rupture, but through quiet erosion. There was, as some described it later, a sense of calm urgency in Burke's response. He did not act out of anger or ambition, but there was gravity in his movements. Some whispered that he had spoken to Pope Leo directly, referencing canon law, expressing concern over interpretations of past teachings and recent alliances. Others insisted it was more subdued, a pastoral note offered with charity, perhaps even sorrow. But one detail emerged consistently from the recollections: his tone. It had been deliberate, clear, sincere. There was no theater in it, only conviction, and perhaps a warning. This was not the first time Cardinal Burke had stood firm in moments of ecclesial ambiguity. He had, in previous years, raised profound theological questions. He had been one of the few voices to publicly request clarity, issuing the now famous dubia in a prior era of church governance. But this moment, this pope seemed different. As if he sensed not just another season of debate, but a turning point, a threshold, and beyond it, an unknown. And so, the calm that settled across the Vatican after the election was not the peace of unity, but the hush of tension. The stillness before movement. Behind the heavy wooden doors of private chambers, senior clergy gathered not in protest, but in posture. Listening, watching, discussing. As in every transition of power, networks reawakened. Groups with differing visions of the Church's future began reconnecting, their language cautious but purposeful. Traditionalist priests exchanged letters. Retired bishops took quiet phone calls. Writers for established Catholic journals began preparing their responses. Most wrote with grace. Some with optimism. Others with subtle concern wrapped in phrases that invited reflection but masked apprehension. Meanwhile, Pope Leo XIV remained largely silent. He issued no sweeping documents. He made no grand appearances. His presence itself was the message. He stood in the square in simple white, his shoulders slightly stooped, not with frailty, but with the solemn weight of what had been placed upon them. His gaze was soft, searching. His head often bowed. His hands folded gently. And while the cameras captured the moment, they could not quite capture what everyone felt. That this was not a man stepping into comfort. This was a man entering conflict, not of his own making, but of inheritance. The tensions that lay ahead would not be the kind found in headlines, but in hearts. He had not asked for war. He had not declared one. But the undertone of his election had already drawn the battle lines not between enemies, but between visions. One that longed for preservation, for continuity, for defense. And another that sought healing, inclusion, and patient dialogue. Neither side wished harm. Both claimed truth. And somewhere in the middle stood the new pope listening. There was no trumpet sound to announce what was coming. No decree that drew cheers or gasps. Just the quiet realization among those watching closely that something far deeper had already begun. Not a rupture, but a reorientation. A slow, deliberate shift in the spiritual atmosphere of the Church. one that would not be easily named or contained, but one that would be deeply felt in the months and years to come. And in this stillness, with all eyes turned toward the future, Pope Leo did what he had done from the beginning. He remained still, present, unshaken. No one could say with certainty what had unfolded behind the heavy doors of the conclave. The ballots had been cast, the names counted, the prayers whispered into the veil of secrecy. But while the precise words spoken in that sacred chamber would never reach the outside world, the tension that lingered in their wake was impossible to ignore. This had not been a unanimous embrace. The election of Pope Leo XIV was not a coronation, it was a conclusion to a negotiation. And like most negotiated outcomes, it left both hope and hesitation suspended in the air. The victors moved forward carefully. The others watched, cautious, alert. The College of Cardinals stood divided not in open rebellion, but in quiet reservation. The Church, in her timeless rhythm, braced herself. The storm had not yet made itself known in public gestures or official decrees, but within the spiritual current of Rome, the tremors were already rippling outward. Storms in the eternal city rarely arrive with drama. They gather quietly. One moment, light glistens off ancient stones. The next, a shadow creeps across the sky. No thunder, no lightning. Just the shifting of the air, the kind that sets the soul on edge. And this was that kind of storm. Not political, not doctrinal, but spiritual. Not loud, but inevitable. It was not confined to curial chambers or papal apartments. The awareness spread quickly from the bronze doors where the Swiss guards stood with silent discipline, to the convent kitchens where nuns stirred pots in prayerful silence, to diplomatic halls and seminaries where whispers grew heavier with each hour. A quiet consensus was forming. Something was going to give. And not because of scandal or public disarray, but because a tension that had long simmered beneath the surface could no longer remain unseen. Two visions of the Church, both rooted in fidelity, both drawn from love, stood facing one another now, not in confrontation, but in contrast. One vision held fast to tradition like a fortress built from Latin liturgy, precise doctrine, and clearly marked lines of truth that had endured the test of time. To this vision, the sacred was safeguarded through separation, through clarity and reverence that refused to bend beneath cultural winds. The truth was a wall, strong and unmoving, meant to protect what is holy from being diluted. The other vision did not see truth as a barrier, but as a beacon, like a lantern held aloft in the dark. Flickering, yes, at times uncertain, but portable, meant to move with the people, to enter their lives, to reach into places untouched by traditional structure. This vision did not abandon doctrine, but sought to apply it in places where hearts were wounded and searching. And Pope Leo XIV, he had not spoken against those who held to the fortress. He had not written a critique or given any reprimand. But his presence, his posture, his simplicity, they were enough. For those who long held one image of the Church, he was the embodiment of something unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity, in sacred institutions, is rarely neutral. Behind the polished liturgies and seamless ceremonies, the Church stood not divided in anger, but poised at a fault line. From the outside, the faithful longed for clarity. But inside Rome, those closest to the center were looking outward with quiet discernment, watching and waiting. For when thunder finally comes in ecclesial life, it rarely roars. At first it arrives as silence. And this was that silence. Two men, dressed in the robes of their office, one in white, the other in crimson, stood often in the same sanctuaries, bowed before the same cross, but gazing toward different futures. Cardinal Raymond Burke and Pope Leo XIV were not rivals in the worldly sense. There were no televised debates, no speeches attacking one another's character, no manifestos calling for division. Their disagreement lived not in headlines, but in history formed over decades of pastoral decisions, theological emphasis, and personal convictions. Cardinal Burke, clad in his crimson vestments with lace and rich symbolism, moved with the weight of a lineage. For him, tradition is not nostalgia. It is a sacred trust, a moral compass, a liturgical treasure that must be guarded. He speaks often of clarity, of objective truth, of the need for moral certainty in a time when everything seems negotiable. In his view, to soften doctrine is not compassion, it is confusion. To dilute sacramental discipline, even in the name of outreach, risks tearing the very fabric of the Church's integrity. He is not hostile to the modern world, he is wary of what modernity has done to truth. Pope Leo XIV walks differently. His white cassock hangs lightly, his steps unhurried, his expressions calm but perceptive. He does not make sweeping pronouncements. He listens. He walks slowly among the people, asking questions, blessing gently. To him, the Church is not a bastion, but a balm, a field hospital for the wounded. He believes the law matters, but that mercy must lead. He does not seek to replace doctrine with emotion, but to surround truth with understanding. For Leo, the faith is not a system to impose, but a path to accompany. His leadership style is not weakness. It is conviction expressed through compassion. Where some demand sharp distinctions, he seeks deeper conversations. Where some fear ambiguity, he fears alienation. Burke sees danger in letting boundaries blur. Leo sees danger in walls too high to let the suffering enter. One sees a church that must hold the line. The other sees a church that must move forward not by abandoning what came before, but by remembering why it was ever given, to lead souls to Christ. And yet, here lies the heart of the tension. These are not two enemies clashing in open revolt. They are two disciples, kneeling before the same altar, interpreting the same mission through different eyes. Burke envisions a church that resists the tide of compromise. Leo envisions a church that risks getting wet in order to rescue the drowning. One draws his courage from canon law, the other from the parables of the Good Shepherd. And between them, the Church holds her breath. Because what they represent is more than style. It is not about lace versus simplicity, or ritual versus renewal. It is about the future of the Church, how it will walk with its people, how it will defend truth, how it will serve the world. Both men love the Church deeply, but they do not love the same future. Burke belongs to those who stood as watchmen in the night, who preserved the flame when winds of change howled. He believes that clarity is the last defense of the sacred. He sees in Leo a gentleness that may invite confusion. And Leo, in turn, sees in Burke a rootedness that may resist the movement of grace. Two hearts, two visions, one cross. And the Church, vast and holy, cannot walk both roads forever. Pope Leo XIV represented a quiet, compelling current within the life of the Church. His vision resonated with those who believed that perhaps the faithful hadn't drifted away because the demands of doctrine were too steep, but because the presence of the Church had grown too remote. He spoke not in mandates, but in mercy. To him, and to the many who saw in him a shepherd rather than a gatekeeper, the path forward wasn't lined with sharper definitions, but with deeper compassion. He gave voice to the healers, to those who ached not to rewrite the faith, but to renew its accessibility. And in that voice, he carried the hope of a generation disillusioned, not by what the Church teaches, but by how distant it had sometimes seemed. And yet, the people, God's people, found themselves caught in the middle. Not because they lacked conviction, but because they were torn between two gravitational pulls. On one side, a hunger for the sacred, the transcendent, the mystery. On the other, a desperate need to be understood, to be met where life actually hurts. Between the reverence of incense and Latin chant, and the unspoken grief of the confessional line. Between the priest who lifts the chalice with trembling hands, and the pastor whose eyes fill with tears at a hospital bedside. In Pope Leo and Cardinal Burke, the Church saw not a conflict, but a mirror reflecting its own divided soul. It is a soul that longs to be holy, and yet aches to remain human. A soul drawn to beauty, structure, and sacred form, but unable to ignore the realities of suffering and fragmentation. A soul that has grown weary from battle, and yet trembles at the thought of compromise. And so these two men continued side by side in public imagery, but miles apart in vision. One offering correction, the other offering consolation. One calling the Church back to her strictest foundations, the other inviting her into the wounded streets where her people now live. They will not reconcile easily, perhaps not at all. Because in truth, they are not merely men. They are trajectories. They are the embodiment of paths carved by different wounds, different prayers, and different understandings of what time it is in the life of the Church. Cardinal Burke fears a Church that forgets who she is. Pope Leo fears a church that forgets who she is called to love. And all the while, the world watches not as an idle spectator, but as a soul searching for signs of truth and mercy in equal measure. Yet maybe the real question is not which man will triumph. Maybe it is whether the church can bear the tension between them without tearing at the seams. The meeting between them was not public. These things never are. It happened in a quiet room, deep within the apostolic palace, far from microphones and media flashbulbs. A room that has heard centuries of voices and holds their echoes in stone. No aides were present. No press. No transcript. Only two men. One newly crowned in white, the other seasoned in scarlet, both carrying the weight of the ages. No one knows with certainty who asked for the meeting. Some say Leo offered it, extending an olive branch in humility. Others claim Burke insisted, unable to remain silent while, in his eyes, the soul of the church edged too close to a doctrinal precipice. Whatever the origin, the two met. And though no official record exists, what was said traveled like fire beneath the marble. The atmosphere, by all quiet accounts, was formal tense, but respectful. No shouts, no theatrical gestures. Just words, measured, intentional, grave. And then, one phrase fell between them like steel. Your Holiness, what you propose is a danger to the faith. Not loud, not dramatic, but piercing. It was the moment the air left the room. It was the moment silence became seismic. For Cardinal Burke, known for never softening the truth as he sees it, had just crossed a threshold few dare approach. He had not accused. He had not condemned. But his words drew a line clear, historical, theological, and placed himself firmly behind it. To question a pope is not unprecedented. History bears the weight of tensions between saints and pontiffs. But to look the Vicar of Christ in the eye, newly entrusted with the keys of Peter, and suggest even gently that his vision could harm the integrity of the faith, was something else entirely. It was not rebellion. It was not schism. But it was confrontation. Cloaked in courtesy, yet unmistakably sharp. And within hours, those who understood the hidden grammar of Vatican communication, those attuned to nuance, tone, and tradition, knew exactly what had been implied without it ever being named. Heresy. The word was never spoken. It didn't have to be. Rome does not speak that word lightly. But those familiar with the rhythm and cadence of ecclesiastical discourse heard its shadow in Burke's challenge. Not as an accusation of personal sin or defiance, but as an alarm, a theological warning. And in that moment, Leo did not flinch. According to those close to him, he listened. His eyes remained steady. His response was not one of defense or counter-argument. It was silence. The kind of silence that does not emerge from uncertainty, but from deep restraint. A silence that understood the weight of the moment and chose reverence over retaliation. Because this was no longer a disagreement. It had become a dividing line between two models of the church, two ways of shepherding souls, two ways of seeing the same gospel. Burke was not speaking only for himself. His words, though private, carried the hopes and fears of millions. Traditionalists, canonists, devoted priests, and laity who feared that the church, once rock solid, was being gently led down paths that felt unclear. They saw in Leo's openness to questions about female deacons, about welcoming divorced and remarried couples, about embracing those in same-sex relationships not mercy, but erosion. To them, these gestures weren't invitations. They were compromises. And Burke, in their eyes, had spoken what needed to be said. But there were others, many others, who saw the moment in an entirely different light. For them, the confrontation was not heroic, but disheartening. Not prophetic, but fearful. They saw in Leo's vision not confusion, but courage. Not ambiguity, but a willingness to walk into the complexity of modern life without losing the thread of divine love. They saw the Spirit not abandoning the church, but expanding her reach, opening doors, not tearing them down. To them, Burke's warning was a refusal to see that perhaps the church was not weakening, but awakening. And between these two views, between caution and compassion, between preservation and pastoral presence, the church finds herself suspended once again. Not in crisis, but in discernment. To those who welcomed Pope Leo's vision, the church was not letting go of truth, It was learning how to carry it with greater tenderness. They didn't see Cardinal Burke's words as a safeguard. They saw them as a wall. Not a wall that protected, but one that prevented the healing from beginning. And yet, no matter how one interpreted that pivotal exchange, whether as courage or resistance, clarity or confrontation, one thing was undeniable. The words had been spoken. The line had been drawn. And from that moment, Rome was different. In the Vatican, not all messages need microphones. In that city of solemn marble and ritual silence, some things are heard not through announcements, but through the echoes that move between pillars and down corridors older than memory. No official statement was issued. No press release circulated. But within hours, the tone had shifted. Cardinals who usually moved with ease through the halls now walked with deeper pause. Conversations were held in closer proximity, eyes more guarded, tones more restrained. Some who were often celebratory in demeanor appeared subdued. The center of the church had absorbed something, and it trembled slightly under the weight. Traditionalist outlets began to publish carefully worded articles. No names were named, no claims confirmed, but everyone could read between the lines. Familiar phrases returned to the headlines: confusion, concern, the need for clarity. It was the language of alert without accusation. The sort of phrasing that never confirms a moment, but ensures it will never be forgotten. The Vatican had not split, but something had shifted beneath its surface. Not a rupture, but a strain. And Pope Leo? He did what he had done since the beginning. He remained silent. Not from fear, but from discipline. He did not answer Burke's words in a homily. He did not reference the exchange in a press conference. Instead, he kept walking. Visiting victims of abuse. Celebrating small, untelevised masses in forgotten parishes. Sending handwritten letters to dioceses overwhelmed by loss or scandal. In each of these actions, he offered a quiet response to those who questioned his orthodoxy. I will not lead through fear. This wasn't fragility. It was fortitude. Because Leo understood the magnitude of what had occurred. He understood what it meant for a cardinal, a prince of the church, to stand before him and question the direction of his papacy. He understood how these moments echo through generations. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, that within the careful architecture of ecclesial power, words like Burke's do more than express concern. They activate systems. They awaken networks. They shift allegiances. But Pope Leo did not retreat. Because in his mind, the church was not sustained by the defense of structure, but by the daring risk of love. And Cardinal Burke, he did not back down either. Though the tone in his voice may have grown more solemn, his conviction remained untouched. He continued to speak publicly, to write, to gather quietly with others who shared his view that the church stood at a dangerous crossroads. His following grew not just among scholars or clergy, but among laypeople who looked to him as a watchman, a voice for those who feared that in the name of mercy, something vital was being lost. And though there was no open conflict, the divide beneath the surface widened. Rome has known many struggles. It has weathered councils, controversies, internal corrections. But this felt different. Not larger, not louder, more intimate. Two men, both faithful, both sincere, standing across from one another not just as individuals, but as emblems of two visions of what the church is meant to be. Not just a disagreement over strategy, but a disagreement over identity itself. What is faith? What is mercy? What does it mean to be church? Burke and Leo did not engage in shouting matches or official condemnations. Their confrontation unfolded in posture, in tone, in presence. One carved his message with precision, drawing lines in the sand. The other extended his hand across it. One believed the greatest danger was compromise. The other believed it was distance. And in that room, behind closed doors, with that single, carefully spoken phrase, the first quiet tremor shook the ground beneath them both. It was not a war of declarations. It was a battle of spirits. And though the moment was unseen by the public, its aftershock rippled far beyond Vatican walls. As always, it began the way such things do, not with announcements or anathemas, but with a glance, a whisper, a hesitation. With two faithful men, kneeling in the same chapel, gazing upon the same crucified Lord, each wondering in silence whether the other still recognized the same gospel in the world they now faced. The Church has felt this tension before. It has known the deep discomfort of divergence. The Protestant Reformation did not begin with violence. It began with a monk and a plea. 95 Theses, hammered to a church door not to destroy, but to be heard. And from that door, fire spread not only through doctrine, but through fear, through resistance, through the paralysis of pride. The Church blinked, and then it bled. Centuries later, Vatican I would gather in answer to another storm. Faced with rising secularism and the intellectual tremors of the modern age, the Council reaffirmed the authority of the papacy, articulating infallibility with historic clarity. It was meant to anchor the Church, and in many ways it did. But it did not come without cost. For in drawing its lines, it also silenced voices not out of rebellion, but of conscience, voices that asked not for erosion, but for participation. History does not repeat itself in details, but it often rhymes in patterns. And the Church today stands in another such moment. The walls are not crumbling. The roof has not fallen. But within the house, the rooms are filled with tension. Not explosive, but stretching. And somewhere deep within the palace walls, beneath ancient frescoes and golden ceilings, the echo of one conversation between one pope and one cardinal still lingers. Not because it ended anything, but because it revealed that something long hidden had surfaced again. Then came Vatican Roman II, a council unlike any before it. A breath of fresh air. A window flung open to let the light in. It wasn't called to condemn, but to renew, to invite the Church to speak again in the language of a changing world. Latin gave way to local tongues. Altars turned to face the people. The sharp edges of anathema were softened into dialogue. Hope filled the hearts of many. But with hope came uncertainty. And in the years that followed, bishops, priests, and laity found themselves caught in a current of change that felt at times like a tide rising too fast to manage. Some swam with it. Others clung to the shoreline. But all were left changed. Each moment in church history bears its own context, its own questions. Yet beneath every wave of reform, beneath every counsel or correction, there lies a haunting continuity, a single, enduring question. What kind of church are we becoming? And that question, cloaked in new language, has returned once again. Today it arrives not in the garments of the 1960s, but in modern robes. It speaks in the vocabulary of synodality, accompaniment, inclusion, and mercy. Yet its spirit is ancient. Its tremor is familiar. You can hear it whispered in the seminaries, where young men in cassocks wonder whether they are being trained for faithfulness or for failure. You can feel it in the parishes, where older Catholics still flinch when the Latin Mass disappears from the bulletin. You can see it in the halls of the Vatican, where curial officials speak more cautiously, knowing that a single comment misheard, misquoted can shift alliances. These are not the tremors of collapse. They are the quiet quakes that precede transformation or division. The spirit of schism doesn't always arrive with banners or bold proclamations. Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it comes dressed in consensus documents, published in gentle tones and pastoral phrasing. But beneath the wording, the heart may already be drifting. And today, in the shadowed corners of Rome and in the headlines beyond, that spirit stirs again. This time, the division is not over indulgences, not over the nature of papal authority in theory. This time, the crisis centers on truth itself, on how it is lived, how it is taught, and whether it still has the power to hold the Church together when love and law appear to pull in opposite directions. Cardinal Burke is not calling for revolt. He is calling for restoration. His sermons are prayers for repentance. His writings plead for the Church to rediscover its foundations. And yet, to many who follow him, the tone suggests something more. A readiness. A decision nearing its edge. A line being drawn not just in sand, but in conscience. One that may not move again. Pope Leo XIV, for his part, is not staging any rebellion. He issues no calls for doctrinal revolution. But to those who have been raised on declarations and decrees, his gentleness feels jarring. He speaks of accompaniment when they expect absolutes. He offers discernment where they anticipate definition. He steps into the suffering of others, not with condemnation, but with compassion. And while he does not abandon the altar, he refuses to treat it like a fortress. He believes it is a place of welcome, a place of healing. The church is now marked by factions with names and identities. Some call themselves the remnant, guardians of the sacred and the pure. Others see themselves as the future, architects of renewal and inclusion. Each carries with it conviction. Each claims the gospel. But their spirits move in opposite directions, and it has become harder and harder to believe they can continue in communion without strain. The church is not being pulled east and west as it was in 1054. It is being stretched backward and forward, inward and outward. And in that strain, the fibers are beginning to fray. In Germany, bishops vote to bless unions the church has never officially recognized. In Africa, bishops prepare to resist such moves entirely. In the United States, one diocese forbids public funerals for public figures who openly oppose church teaching. Another celebrates them with choirs and incense. In Rome, the Pope speaks of a church that listens. But the voices now grow louder, less inclined to listen back. Some theologians whisper of another council, another moment to gather, to discern, to refresh. They speak of aggiornamento, a fresh wind for a weary church. But behind their optimism hides a quiet anxiety. What if this is not another Vatican Roman II? What if this is not renewal but rupture? What if the 21st century's legacy is not a council that gathers the church closer, but a fracture that breaks her gently, quietly, almost invisibly? A schism not declared, but lived. Not with a bang, but adrift. Parish by parish. Bishop by bishop. One moment at a time. Until the church remains whole in name, but divided in spirit. And beneath it all lies a greater threat, not simply disagreement, but the loss of a shared imagination. Burke and Leo are not debating isolated issues. They are symbols of diverging visions of what salvation even means, of what holiness demands. Burke believes the church is a lighthouse, fixed, immovable, cutting through the fog with unwavering light. Always the same. Always clear. To drift from that beam is to be lost. Leo sees the church as a lifeboat guided by the same light, yes, but called to move. To reach the shipwrecked. To change course when needed, so long as it still sails toward Christ. Neither man seeks to destroy the church. Both, in their hearts, long to save it. But each fears the other might be the one to lead it astray. And that is the deepest fear of all. Not that one is completely wrong, but that both might be partially right, and the space between them no longer holds. Another century. Another confrontation. The words may sound different, but the weight remains the same. New vocabulary, new debates, new faces, but the ancient question still echoes through the sanctuary. What kind of church are we becoming? And as the silence of today deepens, some wonder. Will this be another Wittenberg, another Trent, or something altogether new? Not a council, not a rupture, but a reckoning, a quiet spiritual crossroads. The tremor hasn't erupted, not yet. But the spirit of division, restless, ancient, enduring, has returned. It stirs beneath vestments and behind smiles. Not yet visible, but undeniably present. He holds no throne. No keys dangle from his sash. No Swiss guards salute his entrance. And yet, Cardinal Raymond Burke moves through the Catholic world like a man who still bears a weight that no conclave could take from him. Not institutional authority influence. Not the fleeting kind that rises through popularity or online attention, but something older, more durable. A kind of spiritual gravity. His presence lingers not because he commands it, but because he embodies something others long for. Constancy. He speaks less now. He doesn't need to. His name is spoken in conference rooms, in chancery offices, at kitchen tables. Bishops, scholars, young priests, and wealthy Catholic benefactors, many of them now quietly looking to Burke as something more than a prelate. They see in him an anchor, a reference point, a rallying center not of rebellion, but of resilience. The networks that form around him are not coordinated campaigns. They are spiritual sympathies. Lines of connection drawn through prayer, tradition, and a shared sense of dislocation. This is not power like Rome once knew. It does not reside in thrones or in bulls sealed with wax. It is power of a different kind built in whispered conversations, trusted correspondence, silent retreats, and the discipline of canon law. It takes shape in quiet acts of fidelity. In traditional liturgies sung in Latin under vaulted ceilings. In symposiums hosted far from the Vatican. In donor dinners where 7-figure checks are signed, not to create something new, but to preserve something old. Since the election of Pope Leo XIV, Burke's role has changed subtly but unmistakably. He no longer challenges publicly. He no longer needs to. He simply remains where he has always stood, still, grounded, firm. And in a church marked by motion, his immobility is magnetic. The more the world shifts, the more his constancy attracts. Conservative bishops across North America, Eastern Europe, and parts of Africa have begun aligning more intentionally, not in defiance, but in preparation. The language is careful. Fidelity to doctrine. Defense of orthodoxy. Renewal through tradition. But the meaning is clear. They are bracing not to leave Rome, but to survive without its approval. They are not schismatics. Not yet. They do not wish to depart from the body. They see themselves as protectors of the body's memory. They call themselves the remnant. The faithful few who believe they are safeguarding the treasure while others grow careless. And in the center of that quiet movement, Burke stands not as a revolutionary, but as a steward. A keeper of the flame. He is welcomed at conferences where the Mass faces east and reverence flows like incense. He dines with families who underwrite seminaries untouched by modern reform. He counsels young priests unsure of their place in dioceses eager to modernize. He answers every letter not with haste, but with care, as if each voice matters because to him, it truly does. He does not view himself as a symbol, but others do. Catholic bloggers, authors, YouTubers speak his name with reverence. He never needs to tweet. Others do it for him. Clips of his older interviews are re-edited, recirculated, shared by accounts with millions of views. Each silence from Burke is filled in by those who follow him, who intuit what he would say. In an age where personalities rise and fall in news cycles, Burke has become something else. An icon. Not of nostalgia, but of resistance. And icons, when embraced, do not fade. They crystallize. In some dioceses, his photograph hangs beside those of popes, not officially, but meaningfully. In private chapels, his writings are read aloud as if they were spiritual blueprints. In conservative seminaries, his name is whispered with a respect usually reserved for canonized saints or ancient martyrs. This is not a movement with a website. It is a movement that breathes in prayer and lives in memory. There are bishops today who would never speak Burke's name on camera. But they quote his concerns behind closed doors. They delay certain reforms under the pretense of further discernment. They ask for more time, but what they mean is more space. And when pushed, they return to that moment behind sealed doors when Burke stood before Pope Leo and uttered that now legendary phrase, "What you propose is a danger to the faith." This is not an uprising. This is something slower. A spiritual standoff. A kind of ecclesial inertia, not frozen in fear, but grounded in conviction. A refusal to move not because they lack love for the Pope, but because they believe obedience cannot mean surrender. It is not disobedience. It is reservation. It is the instinct to wait, to anchor, to pause and pray before being swept away. And through it all, Burke continues. He celebrates liturgies, offers blessings, meets behind closed doors. He does not speak of power, but he understands it. He does not seek to unseat a pope. That is not his goal. But he knows the weight of his voice. He knows what it means to offer refuge, especially to those who feel left behind. And perhaps that's what's emerging, not a formal schism, but a parallel presence. A kind of mirror church. One that sings the same hymns, prays the same prayers, but walks a different path. It does not reject the Holy Father, but it does not follow him easily either. Burke is not leading a coup, but something is taking shape. He is not staging rallies. He is tending a vineyard. Quietly, patiently, planting roots in the hearts of the disillusioned, gathering strength not for spectacle, but for a season yet to unfold. and the Vatican knows it. They see the invitations extended to him, the high-level benefactors who remain within his orbit, the articles that echo his theological framing, the seminarians who smile just a little too knowingly when his name is spoken. They know that confronting him outright would only enshrine him further. Because some figures, when resisted openly, only grow more mythic. To silence him would be to confirm what many already suspect. This is not merely disagreement. It is divergence. And Cardinal Burke, precise, canonically trained, ever measured, knows exactly where the boundary lies. He walks it without stumbling. He does not stand outside the church, but he no longer orbits its center either. He has become his own point of gravity. Not with land, not with a title or a throne, but with conviction. And in this fragile moment of Catholic history, conviction is a currency more powerful than decree. And Burke, in this currency, is rich. He has not changed church teaching. Not formally. Not in any document. He has not broken any canon. Yet Pope Leo XIV, without altering a single line of doctrine, has done something more disruptive. He has shifted the frame. He has opened the door just enough for questions long buried, long whispered in fear, to step forward into the light. He has dared to create space where silence once ruled. And everyone on both sides knows the risk of that decision. Because in the Catholic Church, there is a fire more dangerous than heresy. It is not defiance. It is permission. The kind that does not declare, but invites. The kind that doesn't change doctrine, but changes the climate in which doctrine is received. And once that kind of fire is lit, it does not wait for instruction. It spreads. Leo's first synodal gathering was not revolutionary in form. It was quiet, global, pastoral in tone. But beneath the gentle vocabulary and accompaniment, discernment, there were landmines. Not set by intention, but by history. One bishop raised the question of same-sex blessings not to provoke, but to plead. Another spoke of women's ordination not out of ideology, but out of desperation from regions without priests. And Leo listened. He did not scold. He did not close the door. He invited reflection. That was the moment. No doctrinal declaration was made. But something ancient cracked. The silence surrounding forbidden questions was broken not with answers, but with space. The Vatican, trying to contain the narrative, issued clarifications. Nothing had changed. The Church's teaching was intact. But in living rooms and WhatsApp groups and parish bulletins, the message was heard differently. He is not afraid of this. And when the Pope is not afraid of the question, the people begin to ask it. It was the same with divorce and remarriage. Under Pope Francis, Amoris Laetitia had already introduced a path for case-by-case discernment. But Leo XIV has gone further in tone, if not in text. He speaks of so-called irregular families, not with disapproval, but with compassion. He describes sin not as a rule broken, but a wound needing understanding. And while doctrine remains untouched, the atmosphere around it has changed. Because once a question can be spoken without shame, the Church has already shifted. He has not announced women will be ordained. But he has praised those who raise the question with sincerity. He has honored their desire to serve. He has quoted scripture that recalls female leadership in the early Church. And in doing so, he has ever so slightly moved the gravitational center. Not overturned the teaching, but loosened the certainty that the discussion is over. And his critics feel it. Cardinal Burke feels it. That is why resistance is rising, not because Leo has declared something radical, but because he has shifted what is speakable. He is not wielding rebellion. He is wielding patience. A patience that plants seeds of openness, of trust, of theological imagination. And in classrooms and bulletins and retreats across the Catholic world, those seeds are beginning to grow. Professors once silent are now referencing long-dismissed texts. Pastors are quoting Leo alongside the Catechism. In Latin America, listening circles on gender and vocation are quietly gaining momentum. In Africa, resistance is mounting just as fiercely. But no one is ignoring, because that is the fire, and Leo knows it. He knows how close to fracture the Church already stands. He knows how fury will rise from certain orders, certain conferences, certain corners of Catholic media. But he also knows that if the Church cannot face these questions, it may lose an entire generation forever. In private, he has said it plainly. I am not redefining the faith. I am trying to make room for those who were already pushed out of it. Women who have led for decades, but were never invited beyond the sacristy. LGBTQ Catholics who have never left the Church, even after being told they were disordered. Survivors of abuse who continue to love Christ despite the silence of his ministers. Pope Leo sees them, and for that alone, he is beloved by many. But that love is costly. To those guarding tradition, he is not a healer, he is a risk. He is loosening clarity in the name of compassion, and they fear that what emerges will be too soft to stand. To them, mercy without guardrails becomes chaos. But Leo continues, not with decrees, with presence, with gestures, with silence that speaks more loudly than an encyclical ever could. He walks into fire without armor, not to extinguish it, but to let it burn away what no longer belongs, and purify what must remain. Because Leo knows, fire cannot be contained. But neither can the Spirit. Once, they sat around the same table, parents, children, grandparents, bowing their heads over shared meals and shared prayers. Now, those same tables have become quiet battlegrounds. Some argue gently, others avoid the topic entirely. Confirmation dates are debated, not just for timing but for meaning. Rosaries are handed down with trembling hands, while grandchildren quote Pope Leo XIV's most recent call for tenderness. Longtime friends still serve beside each other at the altar, but speak less and less between masses. What once united them now feels fragile, and everyone senses it. The division hasn't been declared in any formal document. No excommunications, no public heresies. But the fracture is already living inside the Church's body. You can hear it in diocesan offices where emails between departments now go unanswered. In Catholic schools where some teachers teach the catechism as dogma, and others rewrite it as dialogue. In digital spaces where Catholic voices, once singing in unison, now echo in opposition. Some proclaim Leo a prophet. Others cast him as a gentle saboteur. The Pope hears it all. He's not naive. He hears the murmurs. He reads the reports from bishops across the spectrum. He understands that every small step he takes, every word about mercy, every act of openness is felt by some as a betrayal. And still, he moves forward. Because Pope Leo XIV knows that this isn't about liturgical taste. This is about something deeper. It's about identity. What does it mean to be Catholic in the year 2025? Is it loyalty to the Rome that exists today, or to a memory of Rome that many feel has already passed? Is it mercy without precondition or clarity that must precede welcome? Is it a tradition held still like relics under glass, or tradition alive enough to keep breathing? No synod can answer that entirely. No encyclical can resolve it. Because this is not a top-down schism. It is bottom-up. A slow, tectonic shift. A reckoning rising from the pews. Pope Leo knows this. And perhaps more than anyone else, he understands that the Church's task in this moment is not to win. It is to hold. To hold the grief of those who feel left behind. To hold the hope of those who finally feel seen. To hold the tension between what was and what is becoming. But holding is not healing, and the fractures are growing. In some regions, laypeople are quietly withdrawing donations not as a protest, but as a silent stand. In others, new life springs up, but often under priests who look and sound nothing like those they replaced. Rome continues to publish calls for unity. But unity cannot be imposed. It must be chosen. And across the Catholic world, people are choosing. Daily, quietly, visibly. Some choose the Church of Burke, structured, defined, rooted. Others choose the Church of Leo, listening, flexible, searching. Many hover between, hearts torn, praying not to be forced to pick a side. But the ground is shifting. And soon, standing still may no longer be an option. The language feels familiar. We've seen this before: division, debate, doctrinal alarm. The Church has survived centuries of storms. Emperors who persecuted her, councils that reshaped her, reformers who fractured her. She has bent. She has burned. But she has never broken. And yet, this feels different. not because it is louder, but because it is closer to the bone. This is not a Vatican drama. This is a spiritual crossroads, a question deeper than orthodoxy, deeper than liturgy, a question of identity. Can the Church still contain what is now pulling it apart? Because this is no longer disagreement. It is divergence. Two worldviews, both rooted in the same gospel, drawing radically different conclusions about what that gospel demands. Two fidelities, one looking to the past, the other to the future. One honoring the letter, the other listening for the spirit. For decades, these perspectives lived under the same roof, uneasily, awkwardly, but together. But the seams are showing. One parish celebrates the Latin Mass, speaks of obedience, catechizes for moral absolutes. Another lights rainbow candles, speaks of welcome, reimagines governance. One bishop calls Leo a shepherd. Another calls him a risk. And many lay Catholics no longer recognize the church they grew up in or wonder if they ever truly belonged to it at all. And Pope Leo, he sees it. He walks through these ruins daily. He hears the accusations. You are hollowing the church. You are turning mercy into madness. And he hears the cries of those who beg, please don't shut us out again. He walks between both sides like a man holding a burning rope, flames licking both ends. And still he walks. Because Pope Leo XIV does not believe that unity comes from agreement. He believes it comes from Christ. But even he knows, unity without truth is hollow, and truth without mercy is unbearable. There is a kind of breaking point that does not come with drama, but with weariness. When people stop arguing not because they've found peace, but because they've lost hope. When in communion with Rome becomes an administrative phrase, not a spiritual reality. When the body of Christ lives like a body in pieces, each claiming to protect the heart, even as they cut into the muscle. This is the danger now. Not schism by declaration, but schism in the soul. A church still calling herself one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic, while living as if divided, distrustful, tribal, and afraid. Some believe this moment will pass. That it's just more noise. That time will sift the noise from the truth. But others aren't so sure. Because this time, the question isn't about indulgences or papal authority. This time, the question is love. And if the Church cannot define love without losing clarity, if it cannot uphold clarity without losing compassion, then what remains? What remains if the next generation walks away, not out of protest, but out of confusion? What remains if bishops can no longer sit at the same table? What remains if sacraments become battlegrounds, if mercy becomes suspect, if truth becomes a weapon? Yes, the Church has survived before. But maybe survival is not enough anymore. Maybe the Church is being asked to do something harder than survive. Maybe she is being asked to be transformed. Not into something new, but into something honest. Into something crucified. Because the Church cannot pretend the fracture isn't real. She must pass through it. She must grieve. She must listen. She must let go of her own certainty just long enough for the Spirit to speak again. That is Pope Leo's gamble. That is Cardinal Burke's fear. And that is the moment we now inhabit. The Church is still standing. But so was the temple in Jerusalem. Until it wasn't. Until the Spirit moved elsewhere. And so we end not with triumph. Not with clarity. But with the most haunting question of all. If tradition and reform can no longer walk together, what will remain?